Hello again. This video looks at the impact of globalization on the state. So globalization. Globalization is the process by which countries have become more culturally, economically, and politically interconnected. Most people think it started with a technologically driven gradual decrease in the cost of trade, communication, and the transport of goods and people. Many scholars have noted that the ease with which information technology, people, and money can now cross borders has serious implications for how states conduct their business, and especially their autonomy and their capacity. And that's the subject of the Philip Cerny article that you had to read for today. Cerny starts with three interrelated sets of facts about the world in which we live in today. One, economic processes of both production and distribution of goods and services are more multinational than ever. So, for example, Chrysler today designs cars in Detroit, but builds their engines in Düsseldorf, Germany, has parts imported from all over the world, including Japan and South Korea. So, economic processes of production, in that sense, are much more global than ever. In fact, a lot of people have wondered whether there is such a thing as a national company anymore. What is an American company if the shareholders can be from hundreds of different countries, the headquarters can be in multiple locations, and the production processes and employees can be anywhere in the world. 2. Economic processes are becoming more important relative to national political processes in determining a large range of outcomes. What this means ultimately is that our fates in the world are often controlled by economic processes that occur outside one's borders. Now, for the United States, this is probably less true than for just about any other country in the world. The United States is a very large country with a very developed and important domestic market, and so it's less impacted by flows of trade than other countries. But consider the many countries of Western and Central Europe, countries like Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland, Iceland, the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, not to mention small countries in East Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and of course Japan. All of these countries rely on trade extensively for their national well-being and their level of income. If they were cut off from trade, if they suffered an embargo, things could go very, very poorly for them. Japan, for instance, Singapore, and Hong Kong import almost all of their natural resources and then manufacture and process those natural resources and ship them out. In the case of Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, most of their food is imported. Very little of their domestic production is food-oriented, which means that should they be cut off from that, their well-being would be seriously affected. 3. Individual actors are able to act increasingly autonomously from the wishes of the state. And this is related to 1 and 2, but the idea here is that state capacity has decreased. So, for example, if a company does not like the tax rate in the United States, it's often not too terribly expensive for them to move to another country these days. Now, a little bit of background here. It's certainly going to be different depending on the kind of industry that a company is in. If you're a steel manufacturer, a lot of your assets are tied up in factory plants that are extremely expensive to move. Not to mention that those factory plants have to be located often in areas where your primary resources and suppliers are. So you need to be near a coal region perhaps, or a place with lots of iron. If you're a steel manufacturer, that usually decreases the cost of production. So you can't just get up and move to another country unless those same conditions there are met. There's the last 40 years or so is littered with examples of developing countries that have tried to build things like steel and chemicals industries in places that are far away from anything that would make those industries work. Nigeria has a famous steel mill that's never produced a ton of steel, but has cost, millions, perhaps even billions of dollars. Okay, but for Well, the international economy seems to be populated more these days with companies that are service oriented rather than manufacturing oriented. And service oriented tasks aren't always as location dependent as manufacturing tasks. So whereas it's very expensive to move um, a factory if you don't like the tax rate, not impossible, but expensive. It's much less expensive to move a call center or to move some other kind of service-oriented business, like financial services, for example. What that means is that if states want to impose burdensome regulations or taxes on certain sectors of the economy, those sectors of the economy can move with much more relative ease than they could beforehand. Okay, let's try to explain what's going on here. Cerny's view is that states, at least in part, became important to their citizens because they were able to efficiently provide public goods relative to alternate ways of providing those public goods. So those public goods include security, stability, and prosperity, just to name a few. And to provide these goods, the state provided tangible goods like infrastructure, like roads and railways and telephone lines. A common language, so a system of education. It's very difficult to trade if nobody speaks the same language, as well as things like common defense. Again, having to do with providing security, domestic security, without which nobody really feels free to trade, and everybody's investing resources in protection rather than production. So, states again became important to citizens because they were able to provide these goods. Now, why were they able to provide these goods? Well, they were able to provide these goods largely because they were able to force people to pay for them, and particularly force people who benefited from the goods to pay for them. And that's because these public goods largely involved relatively immobile assets. So things like roads, ports, military bases, and telegraph lines, they're hard to move. You can't trade roads, you can't trade ports. And as a result, that means that people who benefit from them are location based, have a hard time moving. If they move, they no longer benefit from the good. So these things are public goods, and their control over territory meant that states could punish people who would like to use the good without paying for it, namely free riders. So if you want to take advantage of the rail infrastructure, the military security, the ports, and all the public goods of a state, you had to pay taxes to the state. Now, let's fast forward to the modern era. Globalization changes things a little bit. The public goods necessary to take advantage of the new economy, you might say, based on lower costs of trading, now these public goods are less location specific and they cross borders. So in order to prosper in today's world, companies and individuals need access to an international legal framework, not just a national one, international peace and security, not just domestic peace and security, and even international anti-poverty efforts to some degree to stop companies from exploiting the desperation of the world's poor, not just that of the domestic poor. I don't have time to explain why anti-poverty programs can be looked at as a public good, but there is an explanation available. The larger point here is that the basis for success in the world are often located across borders or have to do with interactions across borders. And this is not just for companies. I mean, we tend to think, oh, well, this is about businesses. But of course, most of us are going to be the employees of businesses at some point in time. And so we are going to be dependent on the success of our businesses in order to create and maintain jobs, but it's also just individual transactions. Most of us at this point have probably bought clothes or directly or indirectly that were produced in another country. Most of us have probably even engaged in something like an eBay transaction with another country. But in order for those transactions to be fairly secure, you have to be sure that the goods that you purchase are actually going to be sent, and the person on the other side who has the goods has to be sure that the money that you are sending is actually going to be deposited in their banking accounts. And what that requires is a fairly sophisticated international legal and economic framework that makes sure that those things will happen. If they're not likely to happen, then people aren't going to use eBay or aren't going to transact with people across borders. Okay, so national governments have a hard time setting up international public goods simply because they can't make all those who benefit from those goods pay for them. So if the United States wants to set up an international banking system, of course American citizens are going to benefit, but so are all the citizens from the other countries. And of course, because setting up an international banking system is expensive, Americans quite rightly don't want to be the ones to provide it without having anybody else chip in as well. So examples of these international public goods include currency stability, cross-border pollution, intellectual property rights, species protection, financial market stability, and like I suggested earlier, security of commercial transactions, so some kind of legal framework for commercial transactions. Now, it's true that in the absence of state action, some global public goods have been provided nonetheless, or at least to some extent provided. But largely these states have not been the ones to drive the charge, so to speak. Internet domain name attribution, maritime law and commercial law, and arbitration are all examples of largely privately provided global public goods, although of course governments have come late to the party and tried to improve or change the development of these legal frameworks. Another feature, and this is one that you've probably heard a few times before, but another feature of today's world is that it's harder than ever for national governments to make individuals, particularly high earners and companies, pay for their share of public goods. Often these high earners today are the most internationally mobile components of any national economy, and trying to make them pay more than they think they ought to pay means that they leave. And I'll give you one example of this from my own home country, France. France 2 years ago passed a law essentially upping the top marginal tax rate to 75%. By way of comparison, I think the top marginal rate in the United States is around 42% or something. They wanted to raise the top marginal rate to 75%, and in response, a very large number of French athletes and celebrities either decided to move abroad or actually moved abroad. The most famous example was French actor Gérard Depardieu, who moved to Russia, but several athletes, tennis players, moved to Switzerland and to Monaco in response to this proposed law by the French government, which ended up being declared unconstitutional and is currently being kind of revised. But the point is that individuals who largely finance the state through their tax contributions are more than ever able to resist, which means that if governments want to finance fairly expensive public goods, they often are reduced to taxing the relatively immobile sector of the economy, which, as I said before, includes manufacturing as well as the middle class and the poor, who have a harder time moving and who are less mobile. So what are the final and long-term consequences of globalization for the state? Well, Cerny argues that something else has to arise in place of our nation-state system, or if not in place of it, then in addition to it. States are going to have to, at some level, start ceding authority, that is to say, rule-making power, to supranational structures, right? International structures like the European Union, and that's already a process that's well developed. The World Trade Organization, another process that's fairly well developed, and perhaps even the United Nations for other sorts of issues, like environmental or labor standards kinds of issues, and intellectual property. Well, actually, the WTO has also been dealing with intellectual property. And if they don't do so, then states will have to adapt to the reality of private regulation, which has already been underway, but obviously suffers from large amounts of underprovision. Private actors don't have the incentive to provide, shall we say, a globally efficient amount of public goods. If states don't do this, then Cerny is arguing that states become less and less relevant and less capable, right? They lose state capacity, and they're less able to provide the public goods that individuals and businesses need in this day and age at a cost they're willing to pay. And once they fail to do that, then individuals may transfer their allegiance to organizations that can provide these international public goods that they want. And so, of course, the future is yet to be played out, and the nation state certainly has had a lot of staying power. But as I suggested in an earlier lecture, the nation state is a fairly recent development. It's not something that has always existed, and it may be something that continues to evolve.